everyone, and welcome back to People Jew Wanna Know podcast. I don't have a guest for you today, it's just me. I decided that this week I wanted to do a solo episode to tell you about a trip I just took to Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan with a Jewish organization called JDC Entwine. This trip changed my life in the best way imaginable, and if we're talking about remarkable Jewish people, then the work of JDC and its worldwide communities truly fits the bill. I imagine that a good chunk of you don't know what JDC Entwine is. I only learned about this organization in college when I went to the University of Minnesota. JDC stands for the Joint Distribution Committee. It's a global nonprofit whose tagline is the Global Jewish 911. They are a leading global Jewish humanitarian organization that helps communities in over 70 different countries. However, their help and humanitarian efforts do not just apply to Jews. In countries like Rwanda, for example, JDC also helps non-Jews. Examples of their humanitarian work include rescuing Jews in danger, providing aid to vulnerable Jews, coming up with solutions for Israel's social challenges, and helping on the ground during natural disasters, public health emergencies, and more. JDC has been doing this work for over 100 years, and in every major historic event, especially historic events that affected Jewish people, JDC has always been there. I'll give you an example of some of the recent work that JDC did in a second. First, I'll tell you that I really like suggesting JDC as a place to donate specifically because whatever you donate goes to humanitarian efforts. I know that some people don't feel comfortable donating to places that quote-unquote fund war. So JDC is always my go-to. With the latest war in Israel, JDC was the number one place I recommended for a donation, especially to non-Jews. 2 years ago, when the war in Ukraine started, I also recommended JDC. JDC's work in the former Soviet Union is extensive, especially Ukraine. For instance, during the Ukrainian war and even today, JDC gets medicine to elderly people in Ukraine who cannot get it themselves. They protect children, especially orphans, and find them safe homes or shelters during the war. In former Soviet Union countries beyond Ukraine, JDC tends to support or fund Jewish community centers, JCCs, Hesed social welfare centers, Jewish teen programs, volunteer centers, etc. Now, within the JDC organization, there's also a branch called Entwine. This is the branch that takes young Jewish professionals on trips around the world. The goal of these trips is to help build the next generation of Jewish leaders who will pass the baton, if you will, of global service and Jewish responsibility. It's also to expose young Jews to the work of JDC in various countries and get them excited about this idea of a global Jewish mishpucha and stay engaged. This year, JDC Entwine will be doing 24 trips to various countries. Of course, one of the trips was the Kazakhstan Kyrgyzstan trip I went on, but to give you a sense of where JDC Entwine travels, I'll mention that they're going to India, Rwanda, Spain, Bosnia and Croatia, Italy, UAE, Georgia and Azerbaijan, and many others. I actually went on the JDC trip to UAE in 2022. It was a very different trip than the one I went on now. I have to say, the K&K trip, as I call it, I liked better. Most of the trips in any given year are tailored to a specific area. For example, the Italy trip is for young adults in San Diego only. Argentina is only for people from Hebrew Union College. In reality, there are only 1 to 3 trips that someone like me could be eligible to apply for in any given year. And also, if you've gone on a trip already, it's very hard to get on a second one because they like to give new people a chance to get the experience. I was honored to go as a return participant. The cost of the trip is you usually buy your own flight and then you pay a trip fee to JDC that covers everything. That trip fee is heavily subsidized from what it would actually cost for you to do those things on your own. For example, I think I had paid $2,000 for the UAE trip, but I spoke to the staff and they said the actual value of the trip was closer to $10,000 to $15,000 a person. They always put you up in nice hotels. Our K&K trip had a setup where you shared rooms with one other participant, but you could always pay extra to get your own room. Anyone who knows me can guess that I obviously paid extra. So let's talk about Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. Why did I want to go there and what's going on in those countries? Let's set the context. I'm a former Soviet Union Jew from Ukraine. Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan were also part of the Soviet Republic or the Soviet Union until it fell. But at the same time, their people are ethnically different. They are of Asian and Turkic origin. While during the Soviet Union, these countries may have been considered non-religious, Now they both are predominantly Muslim countries. The Jewish community in Kazakhstan is around 3,000 people, and in Kyrgyzstan, it's only 700. When the 23 of us came from the US to Kyrgyzstan from JDC, we essentially raised the Kyrgyz Jewish community count by 3%. A side note, when we met with the director of the Hesed welfare program in Kazakhstan, he claimed that the Jewish community was 50,000 Jews in Kazakhstan. But there's just no way. I don't know how that number was even derived, but we were very surprised to hear it. Another side note is I wanted to take a moment to tell you about the first time I saw Asian people in real life when I was a kid, because they were actually Kazakh. For reference, most Kazakh people speak or at least understand Russian perfectly. When I was maybe 3 or 4, I saw the movie Rush Hour with Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker for the first time. I was obsessed with Rush Hour 1 and Rush Hour 2. I must have watched it 100 times. I was also that kid that fixated on things, so if there was something that I liked, I watched it 100 times. Anyway, one time, my family and I went to the restaurant. It was that same year, so I was a toddler, and at the table next to us was a Kazakh family. And I said very loudly, "Mom, look, it's Mama Jackie Chan, Daddy Jackie Chan, and Baby Jackie Chan." And I was so excited because I was obsessed with Jackie Chan. But obviously, my parents were really embarrassed, and the family, who understood Russian perfectly, was very offended. So that's the end of that story. All that is to say is that I think there's a general interest from many people who are former Soviet Union to see both Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan because it's familiar enough but highly exotic at the same time. Also, since everyone there speaks Russian, it might be easier to get around and communicate than when traveling to other countries. My interests were similar. It's a general curiosity and desire to understand how people with distinct ethnicity and religion navigated the Soviet Union, but also how the few Jews in these countries navigated life. Additionally, both countries have incredible nature, completely untouched by tourism, so it's definitely an amazing place to go to experience hiking, swimming, fresh air, all that jazz. I'll mention that I had this hypothesis that the Jewish people still living in places like Kyrgyzstan might be living through the type of anti-Semitism that my grandparents and parents lived through, because I don't think that has changed there, unfortunately. And if part of me wanted to see what that was like for myself. Whether my hypothesis was proven true or false, you'll have to find out later. We started out our trip in Almaty, Kazakhstan, which is one of the most, if not the most modernized and urban cities in Kazakhstan, besides the capital, which is Astana. In fact, Almaty used to be the capital, but for various economic and geographical advantages, the capital was then moved to Astana. Seeing Kazakh people talk about Almaty versus Astana was like seeing the old Berlin versus Munich debate. I will pause to say that I always have this internal battle of whether I should pronounce the cities we went to correctly, like in the Russian accent or in the English pronunciation, because in Russian, it's Almaty, and in English, it's Almaty. It sounds very different. It's like the whole croissant thing. I'll just say it the American way. I don't want to be cringe. So sorry to any Russian speakers listening. Almaty is a very nice, clean city with great restaurants, shopping, museums, arts. It's pleasant to walk around the street, and it's generally very safe. The program took us to amazing restaurants, and a lot of the participants even complained that there was too much food because we couldn't finish anything and they were worried it would go to waste. However, everything was very good. I was really impressed. We tried the traditional Kazakh dishes beshbarmak, which is boiled dough with horse meat, and baursaki, which are these fried dough balls, almost like mini donuts. I'll add that horse meat is definitely not kosher because they have both split hooves and don't chew their cud, so they don't meet any requirement. Every meal was like a big sit down with appetizers, soups, main courses, drinks. It was really amazing. The JDC staff really wanted us to have a fantastic time on the trip, and we did. As part of our time in Almaty, we got to explore the city as well as visit the Hesed, which is effectively the hub for Jewish life and the welfare center for Jews in Kazakhstan. And here's what I gleaned from that. First, a lot of Hesed's work is volunteer-based. It's teenagers and young adults who are taking time out of their summer to volunteer with Hesed, and I was really touched to see that. They are well-rounded, kind, generous individuals who have many passions and interests, and yet they're taking their time to volunteer. Many of the teenagers there had side hobbies like playing in a band, painting, etc. Interestingly, most of them seemed to be dressed in like a punk semi-goth style. It seemed to be a very popular subculture in Central Asia because we saw it generally just from people on the street. One teenager we met said that she has only one Jewish grandparent and her parents consider themselves Christian, so she's the only one holding down the Jewish fort in her family. It wasn't clear to me how much her family supported her in the fact that she's volunteering at the Jewish Center, but she said that she decided to do a formal conversion and her parents did not support it. The Jewish welfare organizations in Kazakhstan do have certain rules about recognizing someone as Jewish only if they are halachically Jewish or went through a conversion process. So I also think she may have wanted to convert to be fully recognized by the organizations without any problems or judgment. Most people in the Jewish community in Almaty are not ethnically Kazakh. There's a mix of Russian, Ukrainian, Uzbek, multiple ethnicities. Also, most people do not look stereotypically Jewish. From the JDC staff we spoke to in Almaty, they made it very clear. There is no anti-Semitism in Almaty. In fact, Almaty was a safe haven for many Jews prior to World War II, during it, and after. They attribute the thriving Jewish community in Almaty to this fact. My take is Jews in Almaty don't really hide that they're Jewish. Maybe it's different for rural areas of Kazakhstan, but not in Almaty. I'll add that the Rebbe, Menachem Schneerson, his father, Levi Yitzhak Schneerson, is buried in Almaty. We got to visit the Ohel there, and it was a whole to-do, okay? The program didn't include this visit as part of the itinerary, so one morning, a couple of us decided to go ourselves. We thought it's just a cemetery, we could show up unannounced, and everything would be fine. By the way, there isn't a dedicated Jewish cemetery in Almaty. It's just like a general cemetery, and then the rabbi is buried there. However, around him, we noticed there are a lot of Jewish people buried, so maybe it's like a Jewish section of the cemetery. So we show up, and the actual tomb is enclosed in a building that's locked. So there's no way for us to see the Rebbe's grave. And you have to ring a doorbell to get buzzed in to see the actual tomb. So I ring this doorbell, and it connects me to this guy who is speaking in Russian with a Hebrew accent. Turns out it was the head rabbi of Chabad, and he basically said, the buzzer's all broken. They couldn't even hear me when I tried to speak to them. He yelled his phone number to us. I wrote it down, and then we got someone to show up in person with a key to manually let us into the Ohel. It was a really meaningful experience, even despite the communication barriers. All I can say is we were meant to be there because against all adversity, we made it in. I was also the only Russian speaker in the group. So if I wasn't there, I don't think we would have gone inside. Levi Yitzhak Schneerson's story is actually a fascinating one. In 1939, he was arrested by the communists for rejecting the Communist Party desire to eradicate Jewish learning in the Soviet Union, specifically distributing matzah to Jews in Dnipropetrovsk, Ukraine. He experienced a year of torture and interrogations in prison and was sentenced to exile in Kazakhstan in some remote village. However, shortly before his death, he moved to Almaty and was buried there. The Chabad in Almaty is named in his honor, and actually the guy who came to open the Ohel for us was also named Levi. In 2020, the place where Levi Schneerson is buried became considered a Kazakh National Heritage Site in cooperation with the U.S. Schneerson was a distinguished Kabbalist, which is not unexpected among Chabadniks, and once the Soviet Union fell in 1991, so little under 50 years after his death, the KGB admitted that Schneerson was completely framed. The president of Kazakhstan, Nursultan Nazarbayev, I don't know how to say that with an American accent, okay? He gave the KGB files on Schneerson to some Chabadniks, and now they reside in a library somewhere. I'll mention that my grandma's brother actually knew Nursultan Nazarbayev personally, granted before he was president, but they worked together in the Soviet Union. So that's my direct connection to Kazakhstan, which I also talked about when I interviewed for the JDC Entwine program. Okay, what else do I have in my notes about Almaty for you? We learned that a lot of the Jews that lived in Kazakhstan moved to Israel. They made Aliyah. And in speaking with parents, they all echoed that they want their kids to have more opportunities, so that's what prompted their desire for immigration. Some of the people we met live in Israel or have sent their kids to live in Israel, but have returned to Kazakhstan for the summer. All of us on the trip got to do a house visit. There were 23 of us on the program, and we split up into groups of 5 or so to visit the various Jewish elderly in their homes. These are the elderly that receive support from JDC. My group visited a woman who is 86 years old. She was a doctor for many years. Her story was very, very difficult. It included anti-Semitism, death, starvation, persecution, being poor for many, many years. And other groups would echo the same things from what they heard from their elderly. Hearing these elderly people speak very matter of fact about the hardships and their lives, it's just unfathomable. We were all really touched. But I'll tell you, we also spent time in our larger group with the elderly, and there were probably 10 of them, and we did crafts together. And the resilience and delight and joy of life from these people, it's incredible. It's really, really inspiring. And hearing them break out into song and dance, it's so beautiful. Before I move on to talk about Kyrgyzstan, I'll conclude by saying that despite Kazakhstan being a Muslim country, Almaty didn't feel Muslim or religious at all. You didn't pick up on the city having a predominant religion generally. We did talk to some of our translators and staff, and they said that there is, however, a desire to nationalize Kazakhstan, make sure that Kazakh is the first language, and also increase popularity of Islam. Talking to people there, it did kind of feel like Kazakh was almost a second language there. And as a Ukrainian, I can understand the desire of people to make their national language their first language. Anyway, moving on. So Kyrgyzstan, unlike Kazakhstan, it felt very Muslim, at least to me, the second we landed. Lots of people in hijabs, many mosques, even coming out of the airport on the way to the hotel. Very different vibe. Kyrgyzstan is also the second poorest country in Central Asia, whereas Kazakhstan is the richest country in Central Asia. So the difference was felt right away. Oh, you know what? Important tangent. We need to discuss Borat. So the satirical movie Borat by Sacha Baron Cohen is obviously based on Kazakhstan. In Kazakhstan, it is incredibly offensive to mention Borat in any way, shape, form. Kazakh people think it's not representative at all and is just generally very offensive. I'm pretty sure the movie's banned there. And honestly, I know we only saw one town in Kazakhstan, but it definitely didn't feel like Borat. If anything did feel like Borat, it was Kyrgyzstan. A lot more rural and definitely not as progressive in their thinking. As I mentioned, there are only 700 Jews left in Kyrgyzstan. Most are in the capital, Bishkek. Bishkek is pretty modernized, not as much as Almaty, but there are still landmarks, museums, things to do. They even have a whole communist square with statues of Lenin, Karl Marx. In Kazakhstan, there was also a lot of visible diversity among people on the street. This was not the case with Kyrgyzstan. I also didn't notice a ton of tourists, even in the capital. In Almaty, I saw Indians, even Black people. Our JDC trip brought all the diversity there was in Kyrgyzstan. In Kyrgyzstan, I noticed right away that the people outside of the Jewish community, like the ethnic Kyrgyz people, they seem to understand Russian a lot less than Kazakhs. And the more rural you go, the less they understand. And we went rural, okay? I mean, people rode horses as a form of transportation unironically. That's how rural we went. So after half a day in Bishkek, basically, we took a bus to a famous lake and campsite called Isyk-Kul. It is known as a popular vacation spot, even for people outside of Kyrgyzstan, and it's very striking. It's a lake tucked away in the mountains, and at the same time, the weather is really hot, the sun is very aggressive, so we could comfortably swim. At that campsite is where we met a numerous amount of Jewish families from Kyrgyzstan, and most of them came from Bishkek. It was mostly parents in their 30s, 40s, 50s, and their kids. Speaking to them was a very different experience from speaking to families in Kazakhstan. The Kyrgyz Jews right away said, "Do not show any sign that you are Jewish. We have a severe uptick of anti-Semitism post-October 7th. Take off your stars, kippas, everything." And if you think they're being alarmist, they're not. And here's how I know. When we were traveling to the campsite, JDC had to order a separate van to bring certain supplies to the resort area for us. The van company declined to rent JDC the van when they learned that JDC is a Jewish organization. Now, JDC didn't volunteer this information. They had locals who coordinated this, but the van company, they somehow caught it. So yeah, the anti-Semitism is real. Throw the Jews down the well. Like, it was that level. From what the families told us, they've heard Kyrgyz people say that they stand in solidarity with their brothers in Islam, the Palestinian people. I wanted to talk about our tour guide on the Kyrgyzstan portion of the trip. So in Kazakhstan, we had JDC local staff that went around with us, and they're both Jewish. But in Kyrgyzstan, JDC hired us a tour guide, and his name is Saeed. If anyone goes to Kyrgyzstan, you should absolutely hire Saeed. He's a Uyghur Muslim. For those who are not familiar, the Uyghurs are a Turkic ethnic group from Central and East Asia who are Muslim. The community lives close, or even what's considered within modern-day China. And today, the Chinese government oppresses and murders them because they're Muslim. China has created re-education camps for them where they have to live involuntarily. And as of 2022, there are over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in these camps. Saeed is the first Uyghur Muslim I have ever met. His family ended up in Kyrgyzstan, and he said that his immediate family is incredibly religious, but he himself is not. In fact, he's very progressive, and we got to learn a tremendous amount from him. He's also very proud of Kyrgyzstan. It was very apparent, and there's no better way to learn than from someone who loves their country. Saeed told us a few fascinating things about Kyrgyz culture. He talked about the distinction of tradition versus religion. He said, if you don't follow tradition, you are not considered Kyrgyz. Now, interestingly, Kyrgyz traditions, irrespective of religion, sometimes conflict with a given religion. For instance, according to Kyrgyz traditions, when a person dies, their burial needs to take a certain amount of time. There's like a waiting period. However, in Islam, which is the predominant religion of Kyrgyzstan, a quick burial is required. So people have to reconcile these differences how they see fit. The traditional Kyrgyz culture is separate altogether from the religion of Islam. It took Islam about 600 years to become a dominant religion in Kyrgyzstan. This occurred through various empires that formed in Kyrgyzstan and various conquerors. Now, during the Soviet Union, Islam was obviously prohibited or repressed, but after the Union fell, the Kyrgyz people picked everything back up. Just like the Kazakh people, Kyrgyz people are a nomadic people. Their whole life, context, everything is shaped by the nomadic lifestyle. Many Kyrgyz people have a summer dwelling place and a winter dwelling place. I know shepherds, for example, would do that where they'd move their sheep around depending on the season. This was the case for Kyrgyz people too. We saw many shepherds in the mountains. Saeed explained to us that this nomadic lifestyle literally influences everything about the way of thinking for Kyrgyz people. People who are nomadic don't have to collaborate very much because if something goes wrong, they just up and move. People who always live in one place are required to collaborate amongst each other. So if we take language, for example, we would say, "Can I please have your pen?" But as Saeed explained it, nomadic people wouldn't say it this way. They would say, "I will use your pen. Can I not?" Nomadic people only won and established dominance by force and are considered lone wolves. So even the language reflects that. This whole conversation with the guide arose when someone from the group asked him about bride robbing. Yes, you heard that right. Bride robbing, or alakachu, is a form of bride kidnapping practiced in Kyrgyzstan. It doesn't apply to Jewish people, obviously, but to ethnic Kyrgyz people. Saeed was trying to set context for how this tradition came about by helping us understand nomadic people better. He explained that if we take horse robbing, for example, robbing someone's horse was seen as a huge achievement since you have to be really strong and brave to achieve it. This is the mentality that was applied to bride robbing too. Now, bride robbing is an interesting thing in Kyrgyzstan because it's technically illegal, but the police doesn't get involved immediately. So oftentimes the crime goes completely unnoticed and unpunished. Here's how Saeed explained it. He said, if you're handsome, tall, strong, you don't need to kidnap. Someone will want to marry you. There's a reason why people have to kidnap. So it's usually when someone involved in the situation is not approving of the marriage. In some cases, it could be the prospective bride that doesn't approve, and in other cases, it could be the family. So let's play out a couple scenarios here. A man and his friends kidnap a bride per tradition. How it works is they'll take the bride to his family's home, and she's kept in a room. While she's kept in the room, the relatives of the male will attempt to convince her to marry the guy. They try to convince her to put on a scarf of a married woman as a sign of acceptance. If the woman accepts, then the whole thing is written off because it's a consensual marriage. It's still technically illegal, but the police let everyone off the hook in practice. So the bride is no longer marked as missing and everyone moves on. If the bride rejects, the family continues to try to persuade her, and at this point, she would still be considered missing since no one knows where she is. The police and her family would be actively searching for her until they find her, and at that point, it's considered a crime and the woman is taken home. The woman has to survive until she is found. She is free to leave the house or she can stay there and attempt to survive. Saeed didn't give us any stats of how often this happens. I don't think anyone really knows, but unfortunately, Saeed did share that there was an instance of this whole thing ending in murder, which is really unfortunate. He did say that there are also instances where a woman wants to marry a man, but her family doesn't permit her. In that case, a kidnapping is technically staged. The woman and man are both in on it. And so when she's kidnapped, she accepts. However, this obviously ruins the relationship between the bride and her family since they were never in approval. Another example of staged kidnappings where everyone's in on it is when families want to bypass paying dowry or bride money for the bride. If she's kidnapped, no one has to pay, and you wouldn't even have to pay for a wedding. So sometimes people do it to save money. This whole custom is obviously traditional, and so the women who get kidnapped tend to be more traditional. Saeed said that pre-pandemic, 30% of all marriages were bride robbing via arranged marriages. And by arranged marriages, I mean arranged on one side, really. Within that 30%, another 30% were kidnapped by men they've never met before, and then it's up to the bride to decide if she wants to marry or not. He also mentioned that there are high divorce rates in kidnapped marriages because people don't know each other long enough and then it all kind of falls apart. Anyway, it's a very interesting dynamic and tradition. I wasn't very familiar with it, so I learned a lot. Saeed said that when he was little, he helped his brother aid in a kidnapping, but it was a staged one, and he said that when done appropriately, it's actually a really beautiful tradition. I do hope I'll never have to participate in this tradition, though. I'm so annoying they'd have to release me right away. Are we kidding? Being with Saeed as our guide and translator was a privilege because we got to learn a lot about the Kyrgyz way and pick things up that a regular tourist may not notice. Some of our other translators were also bad, so Saeed is the MVP. With that said, I have to mention that I also did a lot of translating for the trip. And I bring this up not to toot my own horn, but because it ended up playing a huge role in shaping my own experience on the trip in a way that I couldn't have imagined. Some of the translators we had really didn't speak English comfortably or don't have the vocabulary base to translate niche words. A few days into the trip, I asked the JDC staff to fire them and give me a chance at it, of course, free of charge. It would be my privilege. I don't think I knew what I was signing up for entirely because it became a really emotional experience for me. The Russian language is not like English. It is an incredibly poetic, artistic, and intentional language where there are many words for one thing. In English, we often have one word to describe something or call something. In Russian, there could be dozens. So part of being a native Russian speaker is knowing that when someone spoke to you, they picked a word intentionally since they had 10 other words to choose from at any given time. And my goal as a translator was to find a way to convey that intentionality through English, which is very hard. I felt it was really important because our participants didn't speak Russian, so they wouldn't have nearly as good of an experience if they didn't feel exactly what the Russian speakers wanted to convey. Each of our Russian-speaking staff and community members desired nothing more than for us to have the best experience ever, and the way in which they spoke to us consistently reiterated that. There were also times I had to translate stories that were traumatic, sad, emotional, and in that moment, I didn't have a chance to react to what the person was saying because I had to translate, and that was hard. It was hard not to gasp or take a moment of silence and have to say it immediately. As an empathetic person, hearing some of those words come out of my own mouth, it almost felt like I was saying them, that they were true to me. I remember we had a Havdalah ceremony after Shabbat, and Saeed was still there with us as our guide, but he specifically requested that I translate because he said, I know you connect to this better and understand the words better. It should be you. And it made me fully realize how important the role of a translator is. Telling someone else's story for them is a tremendous responsibility. And with sensitive things, it cannot be taken lightly. Toward the end of our trip, we had a debrief session where we shared the highlight of our trip and how we planned to take the trip home. I think half of the group cried in that session because we were so touched in a positive way by the experience. It also helped that our group was just awesome. I mean, I've been on many organized Jewish trips, and this one is my second favorite of all time after Alexander Muss High School in Israel. It was exceptional. So I think part of it was we were emotional too that it was just coming to an end. I was one of the people that cried. I could barely get my words out when it was my turn. I had this huge lump in my throat, and you all know me by now. I'm not a person that's usually short of words. And I remember crying and saying, if only I could convey even 5% of what these people shared with us on the trip, then you would feel their sincerity, their pain, their aspirations, then I would have done a great job. So yeah, translating for a group trip was a lot, but in the best way, and I only did a part of it. I will say that not everything was so deep. Sometimes I just had to go yell at customer service in Russian on behalf of one of our participants who got bamboozled or given the wrong thing. It wasn't always very dramatic. We even had a participant who downloaded Yandex Taxi on his phone, which is the Uber equivalent in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and he had some serious credit card scamming going on. So yeah, all sorts of moments on the trip. Just by the nature of speaking Russian natively, a lot of the Jewish community members wanted to talk to me because they felt more comfortable sharing and engaging in their native tongue. I got to learn a lot of things that others may have not simply because they don't speak Russian. And I tried to share that with the group as much as possible. Quite a few times, the Jewish parents in Kyrgyzstan came up to me and asked, how do I send my kids to America? If I asked them why they didn't consider immigrating as a whole family, they all had a similar response. But I'll share one specific response from one of the parents who runs a media agency and has his own restaurants in Bishkek. We are middle class and upper middle class here. We are comfortable and know how to operate within society. The corruption here works to our benefit because we know how to navigate it. If we immigrated, we would struggle and never be as comfortable as we are here because we don't know how to navigate the dynamics and exploit the system to our benefit. However, our kids still have a chance. One thing I probed on that I honestly wish I hadn't was the Ukraine-Russia war. It almost came up naturally because the parents would often ask me how I learned Russian or where I'm from, so of course I'd say Donetsk, Ukraine. And we all know what happened with Donetsk, Ukraine. It became very quickly apparent that a lot of the community members are pro-Russia. And when speaking to Saeed about it later, he did explain that Russia still gives a lot of money to Kyrgyzstan, and in general, the invisible hand of the Soviet Union, it's still kind of there. What can I say? Their talking points are straight out of Putin's playbook. Specifically, some of them said that NATO came too close to Russia and their expansion and that NATO rockets could potentially hit Moscow. So in an effort to push back the NATO line, Russia invaded Ukraine. If that's even half believable, which we know it's not, it went further downhill when they started saying, oh, and in general, Ukraine always had a Nazism problem, so the denazification work is imperative. They also went on to talk about how Russia is, quote unquote, saving Donetsk from the 8 years of additional violence inflicted by Ukraine. Don't get me started. Everyone in the Western world unanimously knows it's BS. If the West is somehow split on Israel, then this thing there's clear consensus on. It's really, really a shame. And speaking of Israel, some of the people took it even further and said, if you think about it, what Russia is doing to Ukraine is kind of what Israel is doing to Hamas. Hamas has to be destroyed. Russia is going in for the greater good. Now, this part really, really hurt. But I kept my mouth shut because I'm ultimately on the trip as a representative of JDC, not as Margarita. And this brings me to an important point about JDC. Even though JDC is a Jewish organization, it is explicitly an apolitical organization, and this is very important to understand. JDC does work in over 70 countries which have various political systems and beliefs. JDC has intentionally chosen to be apolitical because by taking certain stances, JDC may be banned from doing humanitarian work in certain areas. So I'll just highlight that as I think it explains a lot more about the organization and my decision at the time. Although I'm disappointed, I'm not at all surprised to learn that a lot of the community members are Russia sympathizers. Apart from the fact that Russia gives aid to Kyrgyzstan, if you talk to some of the members, they'll tell you that their family's life wasn't that bad in the Soviet Union. In fact, their life got worse after the Soviet Union collapsed. They were offended when I implied that the Soviet Union was somehow bad. Hell, I'm telling you, if I asked my grandparents today, my grandparents who lived in America for 20 plus years and came as Jewish refugees, even they would tell you that the Soviet Union wasn't that bad. It wasn't communism, it was just socialism. This is an incredibly deep-rooted, fear-based belief where people don't even dare think differently. Growing up in the Soviet Union, they weren't even taught to think differently. So this is not at all surprising. Now, the interesting thing is, all of the community members are ardent critics of anti-Semitism and huge supporters of Israel. Yet, they didn't seem to piece together the obvious connection between anti-Semitism and the Soviet Union. As the war in Ukraine continues to painfully drag on, and we have the upcoming election, which I feel like will have a huge influence on Ukraine, there's just a lot to think about. And talking to these families reminded me that actually a lot of people in the former Soviet Union probably don't support Ukraine, which is very disappointing. I remember reflecting on that in my room and thinking, I can't even call my parents and tell them this right now. What if they detain me at the airport, you know? But what I'll tell you is I think that that's what made the trip so rich and so worth it. All of these different learnings, experiences, opportunities, challenges, the good and the bad together. That's life, and that's what inspires us to keep going, keep sharing, keep building. It gave me an admiration for JDC's diplomatic approach because they help both families in Ukraine and in Russia. And I remember asking in one of our debriefs, how does JDC decide? Do you help less people more thoroughly or more people less thoroughly if there's a finite budget? And while I didn't get a clear answer to that question, the dilemma is very much a challenging one. I also asked Saeed in front of the group about the anti-Semitism that community members experienced and shared with us on the trip. I asked him, as a Kyrgyz native, what do you think is going on with anti-Semitism in the country and how can it be improved? And he gave a very honest, thoughtful, and deep answer. He said that he's been a tour guide for a while, and one of the first big groups he ever worked with was an Israeli group. And he didn't have the best experience. And as someone who didn't know too much about Jewish people, his initial thought was, maybe these stereotypes are right. However, he then worked with more Israeli and Jewish groups, and as he got to know more people, he realized he was mistaken about his understanding of Jews, and he now realizes what an amazing people we are, and that our group further proves it. He said that the only way he sees anti-Semitism lessening is by Kyrgyz people essentially having the same type of experience and personal interactions that Saeed had. One by one, people will change their minds. He also said, however, that in the modernized cities and places like Bishkek, people are more progressive and more likely to come around. But he doesn't see this changing for the rural villages, unfortunately. Those people are a lot more conservative and close-minded. I don't think they also ever met any Jews, so there's that. Saeed also said one thing that will stay with me forever. Write it down because it makes for a perfect Instagram caption. Saeed quoted Ibn Battuta and said, "Traveling, it leaves you speechless, and then it turns you into a storyteller." I highly, highly recommend a JDC Entwine trip to any young Jewish professional. Pick the place that really speaks to you, where you want to know about the Jewish community, experience the culture, and get out of your comfort zone. I really hope that one day I can be a trip chair for one of the JDC Entwine trips, specifically a former Soviet Union one, because I would love to translate and help again. It was such a special opportunity to contribute substantially to the experience and learning of all of the other participants. And I had no idea that I would. It was a surprise to me. And you know, the funny thing is, when I came home, and honestly still, I haven't really spoken to anyone about the experience. I just told everyone, I'll do a podcast on this, hold on. And it was a total deflection because the reality is, I didn't really have the words until now. The travel left me speechless, okay? And I didn't want to discount the amazingness that was our trip. And I realized no one will really quite get it. The jokes, the crazy stories, the tears, they will all only ever be understood by the 22 or however many participants and staff that there were with me. Even Saeed, on our last night, was like, I've worked with a lot of groups of all backgrounds, and I have to call out, there's something special about this group. And it's true, something was. I commend the staff who selected all of us. And I also commend all of us for having an open mind and showing up correctly on this trip. The magic of this trip will be our best kept secret forever. I came home with so many new friends, both in New York and elsewhere. My New York City friends and I already had planned things to do when we got back. This trip to me is a true example of the global Jewish community. We're all so different, but we came together in this foreign country and had the best time ever. I hope you learned something on this episode today and enjoyed it. I'll mention on the side an old behavioral science trick. So if you don't want people to ask you any questions, at the end you'll say, please let me know if I can answer any questions. And if you want people to engage in the conversation and continue the discussion, you ask, what questions may I answer for you? So I leave you with that today. What questions may I answer for you? About this experience, about the FSU Jewish community, anything. Hit me up in the DMs on People Jew Want to Know. And while I'm at it, make sure to check out JDC at jdc.org and JDC Entwine at jdcentwine.org. If you go on a trip, you owe me. Okay, bye for now. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People Jew Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, follow us on Instagram at People Jew Want to Know.